I told you, today is for our family only to celebrate. You're not part of our family, right? So there's nothing here for outsiders. Leave my grandkid and go.
As I suspected, my initial bad feeling was right. I couldn't believe they'd pull such a mean-spirited stunt. Just moments ago, I thought my mother-in-law had softened a little, which made this even more infuriating. Still, arguing here, in front of my in-laws and their relatives, would be a losing battle for me. So I decided to pretend to back down and said, "Got it. You're saying I'm just an outsider, right? Fine, from now on, I'll have nothing to do with you. Keep that in mind. Goodbye." With that, I left the scene in a hurry. That mother-in-law of mine. After everything I've done to support her, she has the nerve to treat me like this. Completely enraged, I swore I'd find a way to get back at her. Waiting for me outside the front door was my dad, who had rushed over out of concern. My name is Michelle Sanders, a 30-year-old stay-at-home mom. I currently live with my dad in my childhood home. My mom passed away when I was in elementary school, and since then, my dad raised me all on his own. Ever since I was little, I've loved taking care of my dad and helping with everything around the house. At 30, I got married. My husband, Rick, who's 3 years older than me, has been working at my dad's company since graduating college. Before getting married, I also worked at my dad's company where we started dating. You could say it was an office romance. After our wedding, I decided to quit my job to focus on housework since I'm the only woman in our home after my mom's passing. Rick married into our family. My dad says he'll leave it up to Rick to decide if he wants to take over the company. Dad only asked Rick to join our family because he didn't want to be left alone. Rick is also an only child. So before we got married, he was worried about whether his parents would be okay with it. But when we went to visit his family, his parents surprisingly gave their blessing without any hesitation. It seems that before we went to visit, Rick had skillfully explained the situation about him marring into our family. Soon, we met Rick's parents, Kenny and Wendy, who both appeared to be gentle and kind people. They even smiled as they said,
We don't mind at all. I'm the second son anyway, so I was never in a position where I had to take over the family.
Exactly. This isn't the main house, so even if the family name doesn't continue, it won't be an issue. Besides, your father has already lost his wife and is all alone, right? If you were to leave, he'd feel lonely. So please, take good care of Rick.
"Thank you so much. That means a lot, and I know my father will be happy to hear that. We'll take care of each other." I felt relieved to have such understanding in-laws. However, an event was waiting to remind us that a marriage between two only children doesn't always go as smoothly as one might hope. It happened 1 year after we got married. Our family received some heartbreaking news. The kind-hearted Kenny, at just 68 years old, had passed away. Wendy, who was 10 years younger than Kenny, found herself alone at the young age of 58 and spent the entire funeral weeping uncontrollably from the depths of her sorrow. For Wendy, who had a very close relationship with Kenny, he seemed to have been her everything. Rick and I were also worried about Wendy and tried to visit her home as often as possible to check on her. However, Wendy refused, telling us that she prefers to be left alone. Even after the funeral, Wendy kept Kenny's ashes at home, saying she wanted to spend some time reminiscing about him in peace. But about 3 months later, Wendy suddenly visited our home with a cheerful expression.
Guess what? I had a beautiful grave built for Kenny. We'll be interring his ashes next Sunday, so I'd love for both Rick and you to join us.
Wendy explained that she wanted Kenny to rest in a proper and beautiful grave, so she went all out and purchased an expensive plot and headstone. She seemed genuinely happy as she shared the news with us. The following Sunday, Rick and I went to the cemetery for Kenny's interment. Kenny's grave was massive, surrounded by a grand enclosure, something you wouldn't typically expect for a personal plot. Wendy, this is such an impressive grave.
Isn't it? I spared no expense for Kenny. The grave itself was $20,000, and the perpetual care fee came to about $12,000.
What? Mom, are you sure spending that much is okay?
Rick blurted out in shock at the high cost. Even so, Wendy wore a satisfied expression. So since Wendy seemed fine with it, we didn't question her about the cost. However, another 3 months passed. This time, Wendy visited our home on a weekday afternoon when I was alone. Unlike her last visit, she looked unusually pale and troubled. "What's wrong, Wendy?" When I asked, Wendy mumbled hesitantly before making this request.
Well, actually, I need you to lend me some money. I spent too much on the grave, and now I've realized I don't have enough for my living expenses.
What? Oh. No wonder she came by when both my dad and Rick weren't around. It turned out her visit was to ask me for money. While Wendy did receive survivor benefits, she wasn't yet old enough to collect full retirement benefits. Had she not taken that into account? Since this is about money, I'll need to discuss it with Rick.
If you don't help me right now, I'll be in serious trouble. There's a payment I absolutely have to make at the bank's ATM by 5 p.m. today. Please, I'll explain everything to Rick later myself.
Feeling defeated by Wendy's desperate pleas with her hands clasped together, I ended up giving her the money. However, that may have been a mistake. The moment I gave her money once, Wendy began coming to me repeatedly to ask for more. Every 3 days or so, Wendy would show up at my house when I was home alone. Today, she appeared in front of my house, seemingly waiting for me as I was about to go shopping.
Michelle, I hate to ask, but I ran out of money again.
Again? Wendy, you said you'd talk to Rick later, but it seems like Rick hasn't heard anything about this. When I frowned in frustration, Wendy resorted to her usual tearful persuasion.
Don't be so harsh. Ever since I lost Kenny, I've been feeling so lonely that I've turned to drinking. I mean, it wouldn't be fair to bother you all the time to keep me company, right?
As much as I found her request for money bothersome, I couldn't find the words to respond as Wendy began sobbing uncontrollably. Lately, if I didn't give her the money, she would refuse to leave and stay for hours. So for now, I've decided to give her as little money as possible, just saying that I don't have much on hand. Seeing the small amount I gave her, Wendy seemed unhappy and didn't even say thank you as she pouted.
Is this all?
With this, you can at least have some drinks at home. Please enjoy your evening drink in front of Kenny's photo.
That's just...
Muttering complaints, Wendy clenched the money in her hand and left. That evening, I told Rick and my dad that Wendy had come asking for money again.
Mom, what is she thinking? I'm really sorry, Michelle.
Maybe she's just lonely. Why not visit her house once in a while?
I thought about that, so I contacted her and said, I'll visit your house. But she flatly refused, saying, that's fine, and nothing more. I just don't get what she's thinking. Lately, Wendy's visits have been causing me more and more stress. I feel a strange nausea in my stomach during meals. Now that I think about it, I don't have much of an appetite either. Rick seemed to notice as well.
Michelle, now that you mention it, you haven't looked too great lately. Could it be stress? Are you feeling unwell? I'll take the morning off tomorrow. Let's go to the doctor.
Thank you, that'd be a big help. The next morning, Rick drove me to the hospital. The test results revealed I was 3 months pregnant. The nausea I'd been feeling was actually morning sickness. After all the unpleasantness with Wendy, this unexpected happy news instantly lifted my spirits. Of course, Rick was overjoyed as well. But that joy didn't last long. When we returned home, we found Wendy waiting for us, once again asking for money. Despite it being midday, Wendy seemed startled to see me getting out of Rick's car.
Rick, why are you home at this time of day? And why are you coming back with Michelle?
Mom, are you here to ask for money again? Well, it's no longer possible. We're about to have a baby, so we need to save our money.
Hearing this, Wendy's eyes widened in shock.
What? You've got to be kidding me. While I'm sitting here lonely and miserable, you've gone and had a child to celebrate?
It's normal for a married couple to have kids. How could you say we're just celebrating? I wonder if she's not happy about having a grandchild. Could it really be that money was more important to her than her own grandchild? As I tilted my head, puzzled by her reaction, Wendy suddenly shouted in a loud voice,
Enough! Rick was my precious only son, but now he's been completely taken away by his wife's family. I'm all alone in this world. Go ahead, ignore me, and have your fun together.
With that, she slammed the front gate shut with a bang and stormed off, her face still twisted with anger. Despite being in her late 50s, Wendy was acting like a bitter old woman. I couldn't shake the feeling that she wouldn't be happy about the baby even after it was born. Worse, I was worried she might even try to cause trouble. With such concerns weighing on my mind, I eventually gave birth to a healthy baby boy. On the day I was discharged from the hospital, Rick came to accompany me home. To my surprise, an unexpected visitor was waiting for us. It was none other than Wendy. Wendy, what brings you here today?
What do you mean? My adorable first grandchild has been born. Of course, I couldn't miss the chance to come and celebrate.
I almost couldn't believe my ears. Wendy, who had been so critical about us having a child, had suddenly done a complete 180 and showed up to celebrate.
But Mom, if this is for the baby, you haven't brought anything as a gift.
It was true. Wendy had come empty-handed. Seeing the puzzled expressions on Rick and me, Wendy flashed a big smile and said,
I just didn't happen to have anything with me today. Instead, I'll throw a big party at my house next Sunday and invite all my relatives to celebrate.
What? Only our side of the family? Why is that?
In response to Rick's question, Wendy frowned slightly, hesitated, and replied haltingly,
Well, if we invite Michelle's relatives too, you know, it'd just be way too many people. My house couldn't possibly fit everyone, So I thought for now it'd be nice to just have a fun little party with the people we're close to.
Her response seemed suspicious. Thinking it over, I couldn't figure out how Wendy could afford to host such a big event. Could it be that she only planned to provide the venue and expected someone else to cover the food costs? Thinking over the situation, I exchanged a glance with Rick. Rick nodded slightly and then turned to Wendy.
All right, Mom. We'll take you up on your offer and visit on Sunday as a family.
Oh, just the two of you and the baby will be fine. Michelle's father would feel out of place at a gathering of our relatives, wouldn't he?
That felt strange. Why wouldn't she want my father to attend the baby celebration? This was his first grandchild too, so why not let him be part of it? The more I thought about it, the more I got a bad feeling. Still, since it was Rick's family, I figured he could handle it if anything went wrong. There was no use overthinking it, so I decided to accept the invitation and go. Then, on Sunday, we brought our baby, whom we had named Carter, and visited her house. Somehow, the house seemed more spacious than the last time I visited. Even the guest room looked as if it had been freshly renovated. It was spotless and looked almost new. The relatives had already gathered and taken their seats, with an array of luxurious dishes laid out before them. These were premium selections from the most renowned restaurant in the area. I went to the kitchen first to thank Wendy for hosting. Wendy, thank you so much for inviting us today. I can't believe you went to such lengths with these incredible dishes. I really appreciate it.
Oh, it's nothing. This is a celebration for my wonderful grandchild. A little splurge is only fitting so everyone can enjoy it.
Wendy truly seemed happy about Carter's birth. Her thoughtfulness made me smile, and I returned to the dining room in good spirits. However, I noticed that, for some reason, there was no food set at the place where I was supposed to sit. Wendy, what about my food? A sudden wave of unease washed over me. And just as if to confirm my worst fears, Wendy said sharply,
I told you, didn't I? Today is a celebration for our relatives. You're not one of our relatives, are you? So there's nothing here for an outsider like you. Leave the baby and go home.
As I suspected, my initial bad feeling was right. I couldn't believe she'd go so far as to pull such a cruel stunt. Just moments ago, I thought Wendy might have softened even a little, which made me even angrier. However, arguing here in front of her relatives would only make me look bad. So I decided to act as if I were backing down and firmly said, "All right, you're saying I'm just an outsider, aren't you? In that case, I'll have nothing to do with you from now on. Keep that in mind. Goodbye." With that, I quickly left the room. After everything I've done to support Wendy, I couldn't forgive her for treating me this cruelly. Fuming, I stopped at the front door. Standing there, I sent Rick a text explaining what Wendy had said to me, as he was still chatting with the relatives. After finishing the message and stepping outside, I found my dad waiting in front of the house.
What happened, Michelle? You look pale, and you're coming out here all alone. Something must have happened.
Well, yes, something did. It seemed my dad had suspected from the start that Wendy's plan to celebrate the baby was suspicious. Concerned, my dad said he came to check on the situation and had been waiting outside. Like me, he had been keeping Rick updated through text messages. Suddenly, we heard Rick and Wendy yelling at each other inside the house. Moments later, Rick stormed out of the front door, furious, holding Carter in his arms.
What on earth is Mom thinking? Michelle, we're leaving. We're never coming back to this house again.
Rick, what's wrong? Why are you so upset?
You seem to be arguing a lot in there.
As my dad and I watched Rick with concern, Wendy came running after him, crying.
Wait, leave the baby. I told you to leave my grandchild here.
Enough. Are you still saying that? What do you mean, leave the heir to this house? You can't just demand our child like that. Carter is Michelle's and my son.
Dad and I were stunned into silence by their argument. Wendy had always insisted that she didn't need an heir, yet now she was saying the opposite. Why, all of a sudden, did she now want her grandchild to become the heir? Wendy, why are you saying something like this now?
Well, I built such a grand grave, didn't I? When I thought about it, who's going to take care of it after I'm gone?
Her words left me speechless for a moment. Had she really not considered this when building the grave? Wendy, as always, acted impulsively without thinking things through. So, you want to adopt Carter?
Yes, I plan to have all the relatives here today to witness and discuss bringing my grandchild into the family as my adopted son. That's why I even renovated the house to welcome my precious grandson.
We all couldn't help but get stunned. So that's why the house looked so spacious and clean. It was all for this ridiculous plan. Acting on her own, without consulting anyone, and deciding unilaterally to adopt Carter was absolutely unforgivable. That's something you decided on your own. Adopting Carter just to have someone take care of the grave? I completely disagree with this.
What did you say? You can just have another child, can't you? You've already given birth to a boy, so why not let us have the first one? Rick, hand over your son to your mother right now.
Wendy said that as she approached Rick, but of course, Rick firmly resisted. Then Wendy, determined to take Carter by force, grabbed Rick's arm as he held the baby.
Stop it, Mom.
No way. I won't stop.
My dad and I rushed to stop Wendy in a panic. At that moment, the relatives who had been inside the house came running out, trying to restrain Wendy.
Stop it. What do you think this is going to accomplish?
Let me go. My grandson belongs to me.
Wendy screamed hysterically, but with several men holding her back, she finally released her grip on Rick. Overwhelmed with anger, I reached my limit and shouted at Wendy with a voice louder than I'd ever used before. Wendy, so all that money you kept claiming you didn't have and begged from me, you used it for the renovations, didn't you? No wonder you kept telling me not to come to your house. I want every cent back. And let me be clear. From now on, I will never support you again, no matter what.
What? No, the money I got from you wasn't for the renovations. I really am struggling to make ends meet. If you stop helping me, what am I supposed to do? How am I going to survive?
Wendy put on a crying face as she made excuses. But there were no tears in her eyes. It was clear she was fake crying, and Rick called her out.
Struggling to make ends meet? I just peeked into your room and saw a bunch of brand name cosmetics and handbags. Back when Dad was alive, you never made such expensive purchases. Don't tell me you bought all of that with the money you begged from Michelle?
As Rick spoke, Wendy's face grew visibly pale. Ah, so that's why she didn't want me coming to the house. She didn't want me to see any of this. Even now, Wendy started making more excuses.
Well, when I'm alone, I get lonely and end up shopping to cheer myself up.
I've had enough of your excuses. No matter what you say, I'm not giving you any more money. From now on, you'll have to manage the renovation loan repayments on your own. Earlier, when I was in the kitchen, I noticed what looked like an invoice from a construction company. At the time, I didn't know what it was, but when I heard about the renovations, I realized it must have been related to the loan repayments. If she'd been splurging on brand name goods with the money I gave her, there was no way she could have paid for the renovations in full. Most likely, she'd taken out a loan that fit within the limits of her survivor benefits. According to Rick, his late father Kenny, who had worked at a small business, didn't leave much of an inheritance. Wendy had used the modest amount split between Rick and her to build a grave. I wonder how Wendy manages her life from now. Perhaps unable to come up with any more excuses, she simply sat there crying. Leaving Wendy in that state, we walked away. The relatives all looked at her with expressions of disbelief and exasperation. What was meant to be a celebratory gathering was now coming to an abrupt and awkward end. As I suspected, Wendy ended up struggling with the repayment of her renovation loan. Although she stopped visiting us in person, she started sending me repeated messages, pleading for help.
Paying over $400 a month on this loan leaves me in the red every single month. Michelle, are you really not going to help me anymore?
It seemed she thought that if she played the sympathy card, I might come to her rescue. But I wasn't going to fall for it, so I ignored her messages entirely. It was clear that if left unchecked, Wendy's financial situation would spiral into disaster. However, if I showed any leniency now, things would only return to the way they were before. A few months later, on an ordinary day, Rick received a phone call from one of his relatives on his phone. I was with him during the call, and throughout the conversation, Rick kept furrowing his brow. It seemed like the conversation had turned complicated as Rick walked into another room while still on the call. What could have happened? Worried thoughts crossed my mind, but when Rick finished the call and returned, he looked calm. What's going on? It seemed like you were having a serious, long discussion. Rick sighed and shook his head.
It's about Mom. Honestly, she's gone and done something reckless again without consulting anyone.
Apparently, Wendy, claiming she couldn't make ends meet, had put the family house up for sale. With nowhere to live, she decided to rely on Rick and showed up at my family's home. However, only my dad was there, so she gave up and wandered around for a while. Still determined to find a relative to take her in, Wendy ended up forcing herself on her brother, Rick's uncle. The call had been from Wendy's brother, Rick's uncle, who wanted to inform him about the situation.
She's causing trouble for Uncle's family too. He has a wife and kids. Mom's really something else.
Then shouldn't we go and pick her up? I suggested, not because I cared much for Wendy, but because I didn't want her burdening someone else's household. Rick, however, replied,
No, Uncle's a lawyer. I've left everything to him. He says he'll talk sense into her and handle things. If we show up now, it'll just defeat the purpose of her moving there in the first place.
I suppose you're right, but That was when I remembered that Rick and I had recently moved out of my family's home into an apartment. Naturally, we hadn't told Wendy our new address to prevent her from showing up unannounced again. I had also asked my dad not to share our new address with Wendy if she ever came asking. However, there was still one thing that weighed on my mind. If Wendy sold the family home, doesn't that mean you're entitled to a share of the proceeds? Shouldn't you make sure the money gets divided fairly?
Of course, I left that to Uncle as well. He even agreed to recover the money Wendy owes you from all the times she begged. I bet Mom's whining right now. I sold the house and finally got some cash, and now it's all gone.
It seemed the money Wendy had taken from me would finally be returned. Once she made that repayment, Wendy would likely go back to living a financially tight life. However, as long as she avoided unnecessary luxuries, she should still manage to get by. The next day, Rick received another call from his uncle. He informed us that everything regarding the division of the proceeds from the house sale and Wendy's debt repayment to me had been resolved. Moreover, he's now helping Wendy find an apartment where she could live on her own. If Wendy moved into that apartment, it would finally bring an end to all the chaos. Hearing this, I felt a sense of relief, or so I thought. But Wendy, being who she was, refused to listen to the advice of those around her. Late one night, while everyone was asleep, she secretly snuck out of his house. Early that morning, he called Rick and I contacted my dad. We all set out to search for Wendy. While looking for her, a certain place suddenly came to mind, and I immediately headed there. Sure enough, Wendy was there. But her condition was shocking. "Wendy, what are you doing here?" Startled by my voice, Wendy turned to me with a bitter expression.
Michelle, what are you doing here? This is a place I bought, so I can do whatever I want with it.
Her words left me speechless. The place she was talking about was Kenny's grave. Wendy had, astonishingly, set up cardboard boxes inside the grave's enclosure and was lying there. It was as if she had become homeless. "You're not planning to stay here, are you? It's freezing. You'll catch a cold."
Leave me alone. I'm not giving the money Kenny left me to someone like you. Besides, this cemetery is the only place I can be at peace with Kenny. Don't disturb me.
When I suggested she use the money to find a place to live, Wendy glared at me. By this point, I realized I couldn't handle this alone. I quickly called Rick and my dad on my phone. Since they weren't far away, they arrived shortly after. Rick's uncle came along with them. Rick must have contacted him.
Mom, what are you doing? If you keep staying here, you'll end up joining Dad sooner than you think.
That's fine. If that happens, just cremate me and bury me here with him.
Wendy replied, refusing to budge an inch. With no other choice, we decided to back off for the time being and consult the cemetery manager the next morning. The manager quickly went to Wendy and ordered her to vacate the premises. However, even then, Wendy refused to move, leaving us at a loss about what to do. It became clear that the only option was to take decisive action. Rick consulted with the manager and decided to arrange for Kenny's remains to be placed under perpetual care and to close the grave for good. Wendy vehemently opposed the decision, flailing and protest on the spot. But after discussing it with all the relatives, no one was willing to support Wendy's demands. Left with no other choice, Wendy was forced to leave and was temporarily taken back to Uncle's house. The money Wendy had been clutching onto at the cemetery was also used for the division of assets and to repay the debt she owed me. Reluctantly, she moved into a cheap apartment that Rick's uncle had arranged for her. What Wendy was left with was a small amount of money and the ongoing burden of paying off the renovation loan. She had relied on Kenny, who was 10 years older than her, and had never worked a day in her life. That said, with her survivor benefits and the pension she would start receiving in a few years, she should be able to scrape by. With that in mind, Rick, I, and even the rest of the family cut ties with Wendy and her troublesome behavior. Just as we thought we could finally breathe easy, Wendy proved she still hadn't learned her lesson. This time, she started barging into my family's home and taking her frustrations out on my dad.
It's because of your daughter that I'm now stuck living in a cheap apartment, barely making ends meet. My son doesn't even call me anymore, and I can't see my grandson. What are you going to do about this? You need to take responsibility.
Yelling this, Wendy kept demanding that my dad tell her where Rick and I were living. However, my father, always calm and collected, quickly replied,
Oh, and what exactly do you mean by taking responsibility?
Well, since your daughter's the reason I'm broke now, you should apologize by giving me some money. You're a company president, aren't you? You must have plenty of money to spare.
Hearing her absurd demands, my father burst into laughter. Then he turned toward the phone he had discreetly placed inside the shoe cabinet by the door and spoke.
Hey, Rick, Wendy here is saying something like that. What should I do?
Send her home. I'm cutting all ties with her as my mother from now on. And don't give her a single cent.
Hearing Rick's voice coming from the shoe cabinet, Wendy started glancing around nervously.
Rick, where are you talking from? Come out here. How's my grandson? Let me see him.
Sorry to disappoint you, but I'm not there. I'm currently on a video call with Michelle and her dad. Oh, by the way, this conversation is being recorded. I'll keep it as evidence that you just tried to extort money from Michelle's father.
Extort? That sounds terrible. I wasn't doing anything like that. I just want to see my grandson.
Desperately trying to make excuses, Wendy had even hurled cruel insults at my father, something I simply couldn't forgive. I raised my voice and shouted angrily at Wendy over the phone. Enough already, demanding money and insisting on seeing your grandson. I know what you've been up to. Even now, living on your own, you occasionally buy luxury items. I heard it from a friend who lives near your apartment. If your financial situation is so tight, maybe you should stop wasting money on frivolous things. Someone as selfish and wasteful as you will never get to see Carter.
All right, just stop.
Wendy, covering her ears with both hands, looked flustered and panicked. She hurriedly ran out as if trying to escape. Surely, after such a stern reprimand, she wouldn't dare come back again. Even my father was smiling at the screen. A friend living near Wendy's apartment later mentioned that they hadn't seen her around anymore. Perhaps to stave off loneliness, Wendy had been approaching anyone and everyone for conversation when she went outside. Now, people in the neighborhood were saying it was a relief not to have the noisy lady around. I figured she might have been cowed by my words and decided to stay home. Instead of burdening others with her loneliness, I hoped she would take this time to reflect on herself. If she could overcome her wasteful spending habits, she might manage to lead a modest life. Finally, our worries seemed to have ended, and peaceful days returned. Actually, Rick decided that Wendy couldn't be trusted with Kenny's memorial tablet, so he took it, and it's now enshrined in our home. Even though Rick married into our family, in today's world where siblings are often few, it isn't unusual for a couple to keep their respective parents' memorial tablets. My father, Rick's uncle, and all of his relatives were in agreement. With the issue involving Wendy finally resolved, Rick and I planned to move back to my father's home to live together again. However, my father surprisingly refused. Having seen Wendy's behavior, he seemed to find the idea of parents seeking cohabitation out of loneliness rather unappealing. My father had once welcomed us into his home. However, after reconsidering, he said this to me.
Just because you're an only child doesn't mean you have to live with your parents. More importantly, Michelle, you and Rick need to focus on building a strong family together. That's the most important thing.
Are you sure? You won't get to see much of Carter or the baby once they're born.
It's all right. I trust you two to raise Carter and the little one on the way just fine.
My father's warm words brought tears to my eyes. A marriage between two only children. As my father said, it's not about caring for the parents, but about two people in love building a new family together. For Carter and for the second child I was carrying. Though we would live separately from my father, the bond as parent and child would never change. With the love my father had always shown me in mind, I swore to do my best with Rick by my side. As a wife and a mother, I resolved to build a strong and happy family for the future.